When Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen play, you can always guarantee a good fight, and today was no exception. They met in round 7 of the Gashimov Memorial Tournament. Nakamura with the white pieces, and he repeated this f3 variation that he played against Carlsen in the Zurich Chess Challenge and almost beat him. And it's clear that Carlsen is having difficulties against this variation. Remember, he almost lost against Anand in the World Championship. Today he played something different. He went for a kind of Benoni setup with black. But it's Benoni where this bishop stands on b4 and not g7, and somehow with the bishop on b4, it's not as dynamic for black. Good move from Nakamura, bishop d2, and you can see what a wonderful pawn chain this is. And this is black's problem. The way that Carlsen did it, well, he didn't get a good hit against this pawn chain. Nakamura once played rook e8 here, and I think he played in a reasonable way. Let me just show you very quickly what he did. He took here and then played knight h5, looking to play this pawn into f5, and Nakamura got reasonable play. But Carlsen played the knight into e5. The problem with the knight on e5 is that it's always vulnerable to this being kicked with f4. Carlsen exchanged on d5, so they reached this typical Benoni structure where white has a space advantage, but black can try to push his queenside pawn majority, and that's what happened over the next few moves. So let's just skip through these moves. Carlsen advances on the queenside, making the best of his position. Now he's opened up that diagonal. Nakamura covers. Bishop b6 from Carlsen, trying to trade off that bishop, which isn't really doing very much. Now rook b8 from Carlsen, what he wants to do is trade on e3 and then trade on b6, going for an endgame. But very good answer from Nakamura. He put his knight back on d1, so he's going to recapture with the knight and then perhaps move it towards the king side. So around about this, in this position, I really liked White's game. I think Nakamura is playing very well, and well, I think Carlsen's struggling here. He played his bishop back to c8. Now that makes room for this knight to swing around to the queen side, but of course it does take away a knight from the king side. King h1, okay, I think a good move. Nudging the king out of the way, preparing the ground for f4. So the knight swings round to the queen side, but now f4 is possible, because in this position it's no longer possible to play the knight into g4 now that this knight has gone from f6. So the knight has to go backwards, and now it's full steam ahead for the attack. If queen takes, then the queen leaves the king side, and then f4, f5 and f6, it's terrible. So Carlsen had to recapture with the rook, so keeping the queen on this diagonal. But the rook doesn't look great on b6, and the knight comes into e3. Nakamura looking really good here. The knight comes to a nice square, hitting, well, you can see all those squares in green. Bishop d1 prevents the knight coming into b3. Okay, knight d3. It's hitting the pawn on f4. But Nakamura just advanced. Now from a positional point of view, of course, we would love to play the knight into e5. What a beautiful square. The only problem is it's not very beautiful for black's king. You can see these knights can come in to f5 and h5. The queen can come into g5. Black's king is just getting ripped to shreds. That's why Carlsen played the knight into f4. Now that means that if the pawn advances to f6, then it can just be taken by the queen. But Nakamura came up with a very nice idea. He played a4. Now if this is taken, then of course the knight will take on c4. So Carlsen had to just protect that pawn on b5 with the pawn on a6, but it leaves the rook unprotected. We'll see how important that is in a second. Knight g4, Nakamura swings over and already threatens rook takes knight. If queen g5, then knight h5 is a winning move. Now if that's, let me see, if it's taken by the queen, then knight f6 is a deadly discovered check. If it's, well, knight takes is impossible because queen takes queen. Now there's one very tricky move, knight h3. You can see now white can't take the knight because the queen is on prise, but queen a5 wins. And you can see the rook is on prise, so is the knight. So you can see it was worth inducing this pawn move a6. So Carlsen in massive trouble. He tried h5, attacking the knight. The knight has to drop back. And that just leaves this pawn vulnerable on h5. Now let's skip on a few moves. Carlsen brings the queen to f6. Okay, reasonable. The queen has to activate, seeking counterplay on the long diagonal. Knight takes, knight takes. Now, we would very much like to take on h5, but then queen takes b2. And white doesn't have time to get in f6 because you can see the queen is attacked. But Nakamura finds an excellent move. The queen attacks the rook on b6. Once again we see how this loose rook just is very problematic for black. So Carlsen had to move the rook back. Now Nakamura took on h5, which I think is a good move, but maybe I think he missed a big opportunity here by exchanging on b5 first and only then taking on h5. And compared to the game, this is a superior version. Basically, white is going to be able to use the a file here, and that is a vulnerable pawn on d6. Compare with the game. Nakamura took on h5. This is good for white. I think Nakamura has an excellent position. Now, if queen takes b2, here we can see f6 is possible. And if the rook is taken, well, this is just a winning attack. The knight is coming to h6, the queen comes f6, h6, it's over. Carlsen tried to bail out to an endgame. Now here, you see, the move I would like to play is queen d4. Just keeping the queens on the board. But then bishop d7 is a problem. And somehow black just manages to glue everything together. And you can see here, white can't use the a file. Now white could have had this, but having exchanged on b5 first, then black wouldn't be able to activate in this way. That's the difference. Excuse me, just 1 second. But instead of playing queen to d4, which, as I said, I don't think is completely convincing, Nakamura exchanged queens, which, considering that he's a clear pawn up, is perhaps not a bad decision. You know, he stands better in this endgame. Let's see what happened. Well, first, I think it might be reasonable to play b3 here. But okay, Nakamura played bishop c2. It's a very interesting move. And Carlsen declined to take here. You know, maybe he was worried about some kind of kingside attack here. I don't know. I mean, objectively, I think probably Carlsen should play like this, but instead he, after not much thought, he just banged the knight back on e5. Maybe this is typical Carlsen, just playing ultra positionally. The knight stands beautifully on e5. But to my mind, there is no doubt that white is better here. He's a pawn up. There are still potentially chances to attack the king, and the move I like here is b4. And after this, I think white has a huge advantage. Well, if black leaves this pawn here, then you can see you can use the A file for the rook. In particular, that pawn could be vulnerable. And there's also perhaps chances to attack on the king side. But if this is taken, then, well, two ideas. Maybe you can use the C file, you can use the A file, again to attack black's position. And, this pawn isn't really going anywhere when this bishop is able to blockade. But instead, Nakamura pressed forward. Now, I don't think that's a bad move. He attacks the pawn on d6. But here, I think he should just bring his king over. The king needs to come into the game. Instead, he retreated the knight. I simply don't understand that move. I think the knight was doing a good job on h5. And now Carlsen starts to motor. This pawn majority is already quite menacing. Here, for example, this is not a bad idea. Forcing the bishop to a poor square. I don't think white is worse here. You can put the knight to c3, but I also think black is doing all right here, considering that bishop on b1 has no squares. Instead, Carlsen actually played more ambitiously. It's a good move, bishop d7, because he's starting to set up threats against the knight. And for example, if the knight moves to d4, that's the square you'd like to play it, then after b3, c3, and this is suddenly extremely awkward, and bishop d3, here's the point. You can get rid of that bishop, and the pawn is supported. And now, well, it's just gone horribly wrong for Nakamura. He brought his king up. I can understand that when these pawns are rolling down the board, but the game has turned completely. And, well, Nakamura was running short of time. He had to get to move 40, but he found that his position was absolutely dire here. Well, the knight is attacked. It has to defend the bishop, but, well, it has to move. So he took, and now Carlsen played the best. He took on c2, covering the pawn. This knight is still hit. Now, if knight takes d6, what we do first is push the knight away, and when the knight moves, this one comes in, and knight d2. And that's the end for the rook. So the knight has to come back to d4, and that covers the f3 square. But still, it's already very, very bad for white. I mean, maybe b3 here is even more convincing than the game. Carlsen played rook d2. He said after the game, well, I saw this move, it looked good. I didn't see the reason to look at b3. And rook d2 is good. It's a forcing variation. This is white's plan, to try to simplify. But rook e8 is excellent. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to give white good advice here. Let me see. Well, I mean, knight takes e5 is objectively the best move, probably, to reach this rook and pawn endgame. But I'm sure that black is winning this position after king g7. Okay, the king just wants to trot across to take d5 and support the b pawn. Objectively, I'm sure that black is winning here, but maybe it's a little bit tricky. But yeah, apart from that, basically black is going to come in with the knight, take on e4. It's dreadful. Nakamura tried rook a4, but it's gone basically. And knight f2. I mean, I think there are many ways to win here. The knight simply can't help If knight c6, then, well, let's just take on e4, and this knight is spinning around into c3. So instead Nakamura played rook a2, but this is utterly lost. White has to give up the exchange now. Threat just to take here and so on, and then rook e2. You break through to the king. So he took, but now he's a clear exchange down, and good move from Carlsen. You want to play king g7 and just make sure everything's secure before you start taking these pawns. Let's just go through the last few moves, but white is utterly lost now. And after this, that's a good move, rook e8. If knight takes pawn, then you take on d5, and you can see the knight is trapped. There's nothing to stop king g7 and rook f8, and it's a goner. So after rook e8, Nakamura resigned. Well, if Nakamura wants to be Carlsen's main rival in the future, then, you know, he's somehow got to get over this mental block. He had maybe not a winning position today, but a very strong position. But once he reached this endgame, frankly, he collapsed. It was a total collapse. And yeah, clearly he has a psychological problem against Carlsen. But on the other hand, I think Nakamura showed that Carlsen is vulnerable in these kind of non-standard positions that, you know, can be reached via this f3 variation. So Carlsen showed some weakness there, although in the second half of the game Carlsen really played superbly. So there we go. After 7 rounds, Carlsen leads. The other 2 games in the tournament were drawn. So Carlsen leads with 4.5, and Radyabov has 4. Caruana, Karyakin have 3.5. Nakamura 3, Mamedyarov 2.5. 3 rounds to go, and Carlsen is the sole leader.